Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire supported by Glenlivet Books. President Trump getting COVID-19 has thrown the American elections into turmoil. There is now confusion, there is uncertainty, and for many the big question is, what does this mean for the president's election prospects? With me to address those questions is the US National Editor of the Financial Times, Edward Luce. Before Mr. Luce went to America, he was the Chief of Bureau of the Financial Times in Delhi and the author of In Spite of the Gods, perhaps the best book on India written by a foreign correspondent. Ed Luce, let's start with the president. He's got back from Walter Reed to the White House, but does that mean that he's recovered and safe, or is he still contagious, still in quarantine, still under treatment?
All of the above. He's still under a heavy cocktail of treatment, including one drug, an immunity-boosting drug that was fast-tracked. It isn't available yet. It hasn't been cleared by the regulators, but he got a fast track, including steroids, including a whole panoply of... They basically thrown the kitchen sink at him, medically speaking, and he's still mid-treatment with all of that. Finally, of course, remdesivir, which is the antiretroviral drug, and that comes through IV. So he requires that to all be set up hospital style on the upper floor of the White House where the president's bedroom is. So he's contagious. It's not clear whether or how well this cocktail of medications is working. And the steroids in particular tend to cause exhilaration, hyper-energetic responses, and other side effects. So, frankly, I think it's pretty hard to tell the difference. You know, he did a stream of like 20 tweets overnight, but he tended to do that before he was on cocktails of drugs. So, for me, differentiating Trump drugged up to the eyeball from Trump not drugged up to the eyeball is quite hard.
This leads me to ask, how serious was the infection? Because as you mentioned, he's been given remdesivir, he's been given dexamethasone, and those are medicines that are usually given when your condition is serious or critical. And yet, when he was released, Sean Conley, his doctor, publicly said that his oxygen saturation was 97% and that he had really fairly fully recovered. So is he ill? Is he simply being given these medicines experimentally, or are they actually hiding something from us?
That is something we will find out. Unfortunately, Dr. Sean Conley is taking his oath to the Commander-in-Chief more seriously in terms of public briefings on this than he is the Hippocratic Oath. He's clearly got clashing imperatives there. And Trump is very clearly directing his doctors' public disclosures about the disease. You have in America something called VIP medicine, which means if you're very rich and you have the best insurance, you can get the kinds of treatment that 99% of people don't get. So this is quite possibly a unique clinical trial going on with the president. You have a drug not released on the market combined with lots of other drugs. And we're not aware of, any previous case history of people who've taken this treatment. So while you're quite right, Karen, to say that that these are usually prescribed when the condition of the patient is very poor, that's not necessarily a guide as to whether as to why Trump has been prescribed this various course of drugs. Dr. Conley is, I'm sorry to say, a spin doctor. Not just a doctor, but he's a spin doctor. He, earlier in the year, issued a statement about hydroxychloroquine that was rubbished by the medical profession because Donald Trump had chosen to take a course of it as a preventative measure to getting infected. Now, clearly that didn't work. But Dr. Conley thought it was consistent with medical science, and most medical scientists didn't. So he has form, and I'm afraid we can't trust the veracity of the medical statements coming out of the White House.
You're being very upfront when you discuss Dr. Connolly, and clearly I get the impression that Dr. Connolly is sort of treating the president as a guinea pig because medicines that haven't been tried and tested on others are being given to him. But there's also, I notice, an enormous amount of criticism in the press, on television, of the way the White House has been less than transparent, either about when the president got infected or the seriousness of the infection. Is that criticism also shared by Republicans on the right? Or is it very much just a Democratic Party feature?
It's mostly a Democratic Party feature and a mainstream media feature. That's true. The supposition is that there was a super spreader event 10 days ago when the White House, when Trump hosted Amy Coney Barrett, who is his nominee to the Supreme Court vacancy. And there were dozens of people, roughly 100 people at that event, almost all unmasked. And then many went inside, again, unmasked, like the president, to continue the celebrations of her nomination. And a lot of people who were at that event got infected. Chris Christie, former governor of New Jersey, the man who is prepping Donald Trump for the presidential debates. He's playing Joe Biden in their prep sessions. He got infected. He's checked himself into hospital. Kellyanne Conway, the president's former communications chief, she got infected. Senator Mike Lee from Utah, Senator Ron Johnson from Wisconsin, Stephen Miller, the president's very right-wing young speechwriter, and on and on. There are a lot, and his press secretary. So there are a lot of Republicans who've been infected by this super spreader event. And there is a lot of concern that there may be more Republicans, particularly Republican senators, who are going to have to isolate for 14 days. And therefore, one would expect there should be concern from the Republican Party. I know of no Democrat who's fallen sick because of this. But as it happens, the concern is more coming from Democrats. And the reasons, I guess, are obvious. Joe Biden wears a mask. Kamala Harris wears a mask. And on the right, generally speaking, people are following Donald Trump's cue, which remains his cue, not to wear a mask and to treat social distancing guidelines as somehow effeminate or politically correct.
Let's talk a little directly about Donald Trump. I noticed that whilst he was still at Walter Reed Hospital, he took a drive in a car waving to his supporters on the streets of Washington, D.C. Then when he came back to the White House, he emerged on the balcony and took off his mask. Now, what sort of message does this send? Does he get praise because he believes he's being brave and tough? Or does he meet with criticism, if not derision, because he's being reckless and defiant of science? Which is the main response in the country?
As is so often the case, the response is entirely bifurcated, with no intersection between the two differing reactions. I have spoken to conservatives and listened to conservatives who are saying, look, when Trump says, we can dominate this virus, don't take it too seriously, don't let it get you down, don't give in to fear, go out, live your life, that is what a leader should be doing, according to them, which is leading by example and by inspiration and giving people energy to feel optimistic that they can defeat this pandemic. On the left, and has to be said, much of the right, though sotto voce, because they don't want to stick their heads above the parapet, this is seen as a gross act of irresponsibility, that the leader of the nation is essentially telling people to ignore the entire body of the scientific world, including his own federal scientific advisors, who are urging everybody to follow simple guidelines such as wearing masks, such as not crowding together for political rallies in indoor, poorly ventilated venues. And they believe that this is an act of supreme recklessness. It could have been a moment for the president, with a winter situation approaching, an election a month away, less than a month away, but with America's daily infection rate at a very high base of 40,000 a day and deaths about 700 a day, more than 2,000, by the way, dying whilst he was in Walter Reed Hospital. It could have been a moment for President Trump to reset and personalize the story and say, I understand the threat of this disease. We need to redouble our effort for one last sort of public act of will over this winter to defeat this virus, to flatten this curve. And I am with you. I understand the dangers. He didn't do that. Instead, he doubled down on essentially 6 months worth of what liberals would describe as negligence and also magical thinking, and what conservatives would depict in something disturbingly close to a sort of triumph of the will imagery. And you mentioned that balcony episode on return from the hospital where Trump walks up breathlessly, caked in orange makeup, walks up those steps to the balcony, rips his mask off, turns around, gives the salute, a long salute to Marine One, and then gives this talk, which is triumph of the will-esque. It is a little bit sort of neo-fascist, I have to say, and I'm reluctant to use the word fascist, but the imagery was a little bit neo-fascist.
You're talking about the video message that he sent out a little later that same evening, and I've got a quotation from that which I'll read out for the audience. He said, "As your leader, I had to do that. I knew there is danger to it, but I had to do it. I stood out in front, I led." Many outside America would have seen that as not just boastful, but almost as morally unacceptable. How's it gone down in America? Once again, is there a sharp divide between Republicans who applaud him and Democrats who regard him as a monster?
There is. I mean, if public opinion hasn't yet been fully sampled, but I've seen some polls, and those that I have seen all point in one direction, which is they believe that by sort of 2/3 to 1/3, the nation believes that Trump acted irresponsibly and that he's not showing leadership on COVID. So what he's doing is he's going for the base here. He's not going for the centrist voter. He's not going for the median American on this question. And in that category, I would include older Americans who used to vote Republican, who used to vote for Trump. He won the over 65s vote heavily when he ran against Hillary. Right now, Biden is leading Trump amongst the over 65s by double digits. Now, that is the demographic that is most concerned about being infected and about dying if you do get infected. So I think that there is, amongst the bases, there's a strong sort of polarization in how they view the president's handling of the virus. But I think the sort of so-called exhausted majority in America, some of whom might lean liberal, some of whom might lean conservative, have pretty much made their verdict clear, which is this doesn't look good to us. We're not impressed.
Let's then talk directly about the impact his illness has had, not just on his image, but more importantly on his election prospects. You're suggesting that the polls that are emerging, the CNN one this morning gave Biden a 16-point lead. You're talking of others where 2/3 versus 1/3 have clearly decided that Trump has behaved irresponsibly. Is this going to be very damaging to his election prospects, as everyone's instinct suggests? Is that instinct correct in this moment?
I think so. I mean, some of these polls were taken after the first presidential debate a week ago, where, as you remember, Trump sort of broke all whatever remains of convention and etiquette to just shout and bully and interrupt. And that really did him harm. That was very damaging to Trump, and you could see Biden's lead widening after that. Since then...
Ed, can I interrupt? Did it also do him harm with the Republican base that remains loyal to him? Has he begun to shake that? You suggested that some of the over 65 who were Republican and supported him may have wavered because of his irresponsible attitude to COVID. What about that young base of Republicans that were always loyal to him? Have they wavered as well?
I think that Trump's instinct about the base is correct. And he said before he even became president that if he walked down Fifth Avenue and shot somebody in cold blood, it wouldn't change the vote at all. There is a sort of core of America, maybe somewhere approaching 40%, that will vote for him come what may, regardless of conditions. And there's no sign that they've been shaken, but they're not going to decide the election. The election, will be decided by the remaining 60%. How many of them turn out? The levels of enthusiasm. And I think it's being made easy for Biden. Biden's whole strategy here is to make this election a referendum on Trump, not a choice between two different ideologies and governing styles or two different old men. It's to make it simply, you like Trump, you don't like Trump. Check here, check there. And it turns out most Americans, or enough of a majority of Americans, don't like Trump and are pretty fired up about not liking Trump. They're pretty likely to vote, even if they feel indifferent, lukewarm about Biden.
Everything about your last few answers suggests that you are expecting a Biden victory. The margin we don't know, but you think Trump has lost this election. But let me put an alternate view to you. To what extent does Trump's fortune depend on Middle America? And do they, that vast area of the continent between the East and the West Coast, do they view him with sympathy because he fell ill and perhaps praise because he's come back to work so quickly? Or do they increasingly regard him as a man who's defiant of science, reckless, and has ended up endangering America because he's encouraged other Americans to behave foolishly?
I don't think that my answer for Middle America would differ that markedly from what I've said in general about America. I mean, I'll say this, he did lose. Hillary Clinton did lose the presidency in 2016 because she lost the three swing states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin by very narrow margins. She was then considered to be the most polarizing and probably one of the most disliked figures in American politics. Biden isn't polarizing. Biden comes from Pennsylvania. He comes from Scranton. It's almost a sort of epitome of Middle America, of blue-collar, working-class America. And his opinion poll ratings in those states puts him way ahead of Trump. He's even ahead now in Ohio, a state that Trump won by 10 points, by double digits. I forget the exact number. But Ohio, if you'd asked a year ago, even 6 months ago, would have been out of play. It would not have been considered a potential Democratic win. Biden is now quite clearly ahead in Ohio. So I think it's the sort of margin of voters who are open to persuasion, which might not be very large nowadays, plus the level of enthusiasm in each base. Well, if you consider the fact that Biden neutralizes the enthusiasm of the right, people just don't despise him in the way they despised Hillary Clinton. And if you consider the fact that all the anti-Trump people don't just despise him, but are desperate to get him out, then you have, I think, the makings here of a landslide defeat for Trump, or at least a heavy defeat.
That's very interesting. Let's look down the road. There are still roughly just under 4 weeks to go for the 3rd of November. Trump desperately wants the campaign to be about making America great again, the economy. The one thing he doesn't want the focus on is COVID. Does his illness and the controversy surrounding his illness actually ensure that COVID will now be the main issue?
It has to be, and you're quite right. This is the last subject he wants to be talking about. So he's trying in his own way to turn it to his advantage, as we were discussing, the triumph of the will, the balcony, the extended sort of PR shots of Trump conquering a disease that we all know he hasn't yet conquered. And of course, whatever we think about him, we hope he does conquer, not least because some of us would like to see him healthy and cognizant when he is defeated. But the issues he wished to discuss in this election, to highlight, were radical anarchic leftist forces taking over our cities burning, the anti-fascist, Antifa, the Black Lives Movement, these forces of anti-Americanism taking over our cities. And Joe Biden, so old and is so clearly suffering from dementia in the sort of Fox News view, that he will be a prisoner of these radical forces. So forget thinking about him as Uncle Joe, as a moderate figure. He's just a puppet of the anarchists who are anti-American and wish to destroy this country. Moreover, they will tax the hell out of you, and this economy will never recover. Plus, he can't stand up to China. I can. None of these issues are really being discussed anymore. We're all focused on where, with Trump, it inevitably ends up being focused, which is on Trump. He cannot help himself. He's been getting all the advice for, don't check yourself out of hospital, use this as a pivot moment, be responsible, talk about other things, don't keep continually hijacking the news agenda with your own idiosyncrasies. He's got all this advice, but he just can't help himself. He cannot help but ignore it. It's all about him. This is the most solipsistic public figure in the world, in my view.
Now, there's something else that's happened in the last 24 hours, and I want to ask you if there's a sense in which this might have been a bit of a self-goal by Trump. He's called off talks with Congress on the stimulus package, and presumably that means tens of millions or maybe more who were looking for succor and support will not get it. Is he alienating people rather than trying to win them over just when the odds against his success are actually stacking up?
Yeah, it's a most peculiar thing. Again, against all the advice, is you are being offered money to inject into the economy at a time when it is slowing, when this mythical V-shaped recovery never occurred. It's K-shaped. It goes in one direction for people who own stocks, but another for those who don't. And here we have the Democrats saying, look, let's do a deal and put $2-3 trillion more into the economy to reflate, to get spending up again, to keep people in jobs, which would benefit the incumbent president. So it's an act of pique about Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, and about the Democratic Party in general, rather than an act of self-interest. It's I think, the actions of a president who's not expecting to be re-elected and wants to take down others with him.
Do you expect the second presidential debate to happen on the 15th? And if it does, will it be another testing time for Trump, when people will look to see if his behavior has altered visibly from the first debate?
It'll certainly be a testing time for Trump, because he's going to have to get a test, very shortly before the debate to prove he's now free of the virus. And Biden has said he will only debate him if he's, by that point, non-contagious and negative, I guess. Yes, it'll be a testing debate. I mean, the risk is always for the front runner. So I don't think Trump can do himself any more harm, even if he repeated his performance from last week. The harm there, the risk there is for Biden, when the risk's all on the downside. If Biden, who isn't at his peak, let's be frank, if Biden, makes a Bidenism, a gaffe, if he forgets something very, very clear. If he displays signs of fading powers, then that could do an awful lot of damage. So, I wouldn't be surprised in between now and that scheduled debate in Miami to see the Democrats really trying to raise the threshold for under what conditions they would agree to debate a man who might still have coronavirus at that point.
And when Trump is well enough to get back, do you believe he will go in for the sort of rallies that have been the core of his campaign style, where people don't wear masks and he makes the most ludicrous statements, often even taunting Biden? Will he go back to those rallies, or will he now, having gone through COVID himself and the concern in the country about the spread of the virus, perhaps change tactic?
I have no doubt that in his own head, his idea of why he won in 2016 and how he could win in 2020 is because of rallies. That's his sort of idea of heaven. What for my mother might be a cup of tea in a rose garden is for Trump a rally in the Midwest. It's going to take an awful lot of aides and an awful lot of Republicans to persuade him that this is like walking into a petrol-soaked airport hangar with a lighted match and tossing it, because the super spreader event that he had with far fewer people at the White House, some of which was outside, has caused a lot of infections. Previous rallies that he's held have led to deaths, including one very notable one of Herman Cain, a former Republican chairman of the Republican National Convention, who died a month after this rally held in late June, and who took photos of himself at the rally saying, "Look, we're not wearing masks." He died about 30 days later. So there are plenty of other people, doubtless, who've fallen sick. I think this will be the ultimate test of Trump's worst instincts.
You're talking of
the best advice.
You're talking of the large number of people who've fallen sick, particularly at that event when the new Supreme Court nominee was being presented. I noticed today that practically every member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, including the chairman, are in quarantine. And I also noticed, as you mentioned yourself, that a very large number of Trump's advisors either have the virus or are in quarantine. Is this administration actually able to govern, or is it becoming close to paralyzed? Or is that an exaggeration?
Is it able to govern? It's a very good question, because it presupposes it was governing before the president contracted COVID. Look, the White House is a ghost town. A mini pandemic has raged through it. All kinds of key positions are now at home or in hospital with this disease, and many of the rest at home quarantining because they were exposed to the president or any of these other figures. So, if you were looking to create an October surprise, and you were a mischievous foreign player, well, now would be a pretty optimal moment. I'm not suggesting that's going to happen, by the way, but there are very live and very sort of hair trigger situations in the Persian Gulf with Iran, in the South China Sea with China, and elsewhere. So if you wanted, while the cat's away, as it were, to exploit this window, there is a wide open window. That said, there is a vast bureaucracy beneath the president and outside of the White House and outside of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at Pentagon. Decisions can be taken whilst quarantining at home. You can get on Zoom, as we are, and do stuff. But it is a very depleted administration.
Very quickly before I end, I want to ask you a couple of questions about voting on November the 3rd, because it's only now less than 4 weeks away. This election is going to see a far larger number of postal ballots than any previous American election. And I believe, according to the papers today, already some 4 million people have voted. The problem is there are some states that allow early voting, others don't. And then there are a few that actually will count ballots even after election day. And when it comes to the counting, There are some states that will count early and others that will only start the counting on the morning of the voting. So is there potential here for a lot of confusion, making for controversy and perhaps dispute?
There is, a very key feature of the American election system is that it's done at the local level. There are no federal laws governing elections, so there's no uniformity. Quite the opposite. There are 1,000 different systems. And so nobody understands every single county and every single state's varying rules on voting, let alone on what you do with mailed-in ballots. I think about half of the ballots this year are going to be mailed in. Some states like Florida can start counting them already, thankfully, because Florida is so important. So it might be able to declare the result on November the 3rd. And if it did declare in favor of Biden, then we would know on the night, regardless of what happens elsewhere, that he's the next president. If, however, it takes much longer and it's closer, and you've got states like Pennsylvania where they can only start counting the ballots after polls have closed on November the 3rd and could take weeks to count them, then you get what a lot of people are concerned about, especially given that Trump himself has just blanketly declared mailed-in ballots to be fraudulent and that this will be the most corrupt election in history. Then you get the margin there for the president to start 1,000 legal fires across the country where they're looking at the postmark, matching signatures, every vote contested, in which case it could take a long, long time. You could also get a Congress that receives separate results from these states, with the Democratic governor of Pennsylvania saying, this is our slate of electors, and it's for Biden, and the Republican legislature saying, this is our slate of electors from Pennsylvania, and it's for Trump. There is no provision in the Constitution to solve this. And so when people talk about fears of a coup or a constitutional breakdown, it's in this very murky situation that it would happen. And it shouldn't be overlooked that there are an estimated 30,000 armed right-wing militia groups in this country who believe there is a democratic coup being planned. And they will believe whatever they're told. They are very much cultish in their worldview. So the positive scenario here is that one or other candidate wins by a landslide and none of these confusions and potential breakdowns come into play. I don't think there is any parallel universe in which Trump will win by a landslide. So by that I mean Biden winning by a landslide. But if he doesn't, if it's much narrower and more contestable, then we're going to be in for weeks of extreme tension.
You're suggesting to me that there could be two possibilities that are becoming increasingly real. One, depending how states like Florida vote, it's possible that on the night of the 3rd, Trump will claim victory because he thinks he has a lead, only to discover a few days later that the postal ballots have been counted and Biden has overtaken him. But the other possibility is that these 30,000 right-wing militia that you spoke about, who Trump in some senses has already begun to say must keep vigil at voting stations and polling booths, could actually lead to fairly substantial violence as well.
That is a fear. I mean, I should mention that there is going to be, for reasons we discussed earlier about mask wearing, there's going to be more Democrats who are voting by mail than Republicans. So the in-person votes will be counted immediately the moment the polls close. And if you look at votes as counted, it will show Republicans ahead, Trump ahead, in some states where the exit polls may have shown you that once all votes are tallied, he's clearly going to lose. Trump will, they call this, political scientists call this the red mirage, that it looks like he's won. And when he says, look, we should stop the counting now, the rest are fraudulent. that's when the militias come into it. And so if you do get court rulings that say, let's stop the votes, like we had in Florida in 2000 with Bush against Gore, then you're going to get street action from the left and the right, and all kinds of sort of Reichstag fire opportunities for people who want to, who have nefarious goals. Donald Trump's very different to your usual incumbent president. I don't think any other president in American history has thought in their own head that if they lose, they might go to jail. And if you look at what's been published of Donald Trump's tax returns, if you look at the investigations into him by various New York attorneys' offices, if you look at the hundreds of millions of dollars he owes to creditors, what Trump has in his head, and that's all that matters, is it's re-election or jail, or at least legal hell. So his back is to the wall in a way that no previous incumbent I could think of had their back to the wall. And there is a desperation here for a man who, as president, has immunity from prosecution to prolong that immunity from prosecution for another 4 years.
You're suggesting, almost saying it up front, that the next 4 weeks might be a glorious, if that's the right adjective, time for journalists. It's a very desperate, tense, and deeply worrying time for Americans.
Yeah, I don't think, I mean, I was a little bit more concerned before the debate and before Trump caught the disease. And I think those two events have compounded the Biden lead. And as I say, if the Biden lead on the day were big enough, then some of what I've been describing could be avoided. If, however, it narrows again in the next month, we're into existential territory about the stability of the republic.
The very future of American democracy is at stake. Do you really mean that?
Under those conditions. Right now, I have to say, I'm feeling fairly chipper about Biden's prospects of winning. I'm not feeling particularly chipper about his prospects of governing, which is a whole different subject. But you know, right now you just look at what's in front of you, and what's in front of you is an election that Trump ought to lose handily. In which case, the threats to the republic will no longer be immediate, but the causes of those problems will still be there.
My last question, Ed. Trump has never, ever explicitly said that he will accept the verdict if he's defeated. He's always raised the possibility that he won't accept it. Does he really mean to create that doubt, or is it just a tactic?
I think it's probably a mixture of the two. The last time he was asked this question was during the debate. He refused to guarantee a peaceful transfer of power. Now, this is not the kind of thing that happens in democracies. You know, you think of Jimmy Carter or George Bush Sr. or people sort of accepting defeat, or Al Gore, even though it was a pretty contestable situation, accepting defeat and then immediately giving public statements saying, I fully support, we're all Americans, the duly elected president, and all my support in the next 4 years. That was a different era where Queensberry rules applied, when politics, you know, was about competing with opponents, not with enemies. This system is about enemies. There is no trust that if the other guy wins, that he won't change the rules of the game and rig it in his favor over the next 4 years. And that distrust is as strong, I think, with more grounding on the left as it is on the right, but it's held on both sides of the spectrum. The trust has disappeared, and once trust goes, well, democracy is about assuming that, okay, my opponent's won, but I will get another bite at the apple because, you know, this is a game of revolving chairs and there's always another election. Well, if you don't think there's going to be another election or another free and fair one, that trust disappears. And without trust, I mean, trust is the glue of democracy. Without trust, democracy cannot really function. Like, it's the blood, not glue, but it's the blood circulation of democracy, in the same way that fear is what holds autocracy together. And right now, it's a fearful, very distrustful, very toxic culture in America. And it's not like mushroomed up overnight. This has been building for many years.
Fascinating, Ed. American democracy on the eve of this critical election is beginning to sound a bit like a banana republic. Thank you very much for a fascinating series of insights into American politics, into the election, into Trump himself, and the impact of all of this on the American people and what it means for a country that is so proud to call itself the world's oldest democracy. Take care, stay safe, and I hope we can come back to you after the result is announced to talk about what the new America on the 4th of November or shortly thereafter looks like. Take care.
Thanks so much, Karen.